Hello and welcome everybody back to Scottish Independence Podcasts. Our guest this week is Esther Roberton. Now, we first met Esther when we were at a conference called Building a Local Scotland, which was all about trying to get European-style local democracy, genuinely local, with small councils in the place where you live.
Yeah.
But Esther has had a long and distinguished career before then, and very much involved in the setting up of Holyrood. So that's quite an achievement to have on your CV, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is. She was the co-ordinator for the Scottish Constitutional Convention, CCC.
Right. It was really interesting for Esther to sort of talk us through how did it work and what was the context? Because at the time they were dealing with setting up a new parliament, it was before we had the internet, it was before we had social media. So very different political context. So it's really interesting to get that perspective.
Yeah, indeed. I'm just hearing her talk about the kinds of ideas that they discussed and well thought through suggestions about best ways of doing it and best practice, and then hearing her talk about, well, some of those have come to pass, but quite a lot of those have not, and that's just quite intriguing.
Yes, it was very interesting how the reality is matched up to what the intention was. And we also get a bit of an update about the Building Local Scotland. And if you hang on right to the end, you'll get a very short snippet from Jackson Carler, who doesn't normally appear on our podcast.
No, but, I mean, I hope he realises, just how much of an honour this is for us to include him.
Yeah. It's at the very end, and this is in his role as the chair of the Citizens Participation Committee. So you'll see the link there between what Esther's talking about and then what he's talking about. Let's bring Esther into the studio.
Esther, really appreciate you agreeing to come on and speak to us. Great to have you. And you were the convener of the Scottish Constitutional Convention, weren't you? So that was the group that was there before Holyrood was set up, but very much part of the campaign to get it set up and on what basis. So it'd be really good to hear a little bit about the kind of ideas or the even expectations that you and the others in that group might have had about how Holyrood would work as a parliament, maybe haven't quite happened in the way that you saw that.
Thank you both for having me on today. It's fascinating and it's been great to meet you both at these events. I often say that I don't remember how I voted in '79 in the original Assembly referendum. I know I must have voted yes, because very shortly thereafter I got involved in politics, I got involved in my local trade union, and I got involved in what was then the campaign for a Scottish Assembly and went on to be the campaign for the Parliament. And I was a real geek and followed it all the way through, got lots of interesting documents, and I was in the Assembly Hall on the Mound with a colleague playing hooky from work the day the convention was launched. And I remember saying to myself, that's the job of my dreams. Never thinking any such thing, because of course for years the convention was a completely voluntary body and there were all sorts of issues about local councils providing funding, which went to the courts because the opponents didn't believe councils should be funding this campaign. When that was eventually resolved, Grampian, I think it was in those days, fought it in court and said this wasn't a party political issue. And that little amount of funding was made available. There was an advert for a coordinator, and long story short, I got the job and started in December 1994 when my older son was only 4 months old. Wow. By then, Kenyon Wright and others were heroes of mine, having seen the work they were doing. And to be fair, I was a latecomer because the convention had been going since '89 and a lot of the hard work had been done. Of course, we had the scheme in '92 and then we didn't win that election, so we didn't get the Parliament, or the Assembly as it was still called. And the convention nearly fell apart. And it was the dogged determination of folk like Kenyon Wright and Campbell Christie and others that kept the political parties at the table and agreed that they could really make a further go at it. And I often say what we got in 1999 was significantly better because of that, and definitely much better than what we would have got in '79. But we had lost 20 years and paid a very high price in that 20 years. So I came along in the final stages of agreeing the scheme, and my main role was to be a programme called Preparing for Change, But in the early stages, it was really about the practicalities of getting the scheme finalised and organising the launch, which was St Andrew's Day in 95. Once that was launched, I was then into preparing for change. And that was really about beginning to engage with people in all sorts of areas. And the kind of biggies that we did a Scottish Parliament in education, we did a Scottish Parliament in health, local government, housing. But the one that did it for me was the education one, which was the first one, because there were people from all across the education spectrum, teachers, university staff, union members, all sorts. And the excitement about being able to talk about what a parliament might actually do in education, because we would have complete control. At the same time, I was travelling around the country speaking at all sorts of events, as were many others. I had a little slideshow done. I've just given them to the National Library. The Glasgow Herald, as it was then, pulled a real fast one on the Scotsman and decided to have an event in Edinburgh in the what was then new EICC, and they called it Devolution Good for Business ? Which I thought was very clever. I watched the video clip recently and realised I was the only woman on the platform at that. We had civil servants, we had Nigel Smith, who went on to play a great role. We had big players from the bank and from Scottish and Newcastle, all these folk that were opposed. But I did this little slideshow, and it was a dozen slides from, this is how the Parliament will work, this is how the committees will work, this is how you'll do your elections, this is how it will be funded, this will be its powers. There were, I think, a couple of hundred people in the audience at that, most of them sceptical. Nigel Smith was the only business speaker in favour. He'd been Business for Scotland in 79. But people came up to me afterwards and said, you've convinced me. I was really sceptical, but I had no idea you'd worked out the detail, not only of how it will work, but what it will be able to do. So that slideshow took me all over the country. The smallest was in Thurso, Chamber of Commerce event. 3 people turned up because there was a big Scotland football game on next door. The biggest event was probably BP in Aberdeen hosted an SCDI event, the Scottish Council for Development and Industry. Always took a very even-handed approach because they had all sorts of members with varying views. But a senior member of SCDI's board, who was from BP, had heard me speak several times, and he said he wanted me. And eventually they were persuaded to support this event, and 200 people turned up. Wow. And of course, Aberdeen was very hostile. Grampian generally was very hostile. So that was a pretty lively event, but it was great. So I did all of that, and we launched the scheme. We had a convention meeting on my 40th birthday. And afterwards, I went off to an event in London, not knowing that night George Robertson and Tony Blair decided, we're going to have a referendum. So at that point, I worked with Nigel Smith to persuade the convention, and particularly Kenyon Wright, who was understandably reluctant to let go. But Nigel had paid out of his own pocket to do really significant research. And he said, if we're going to win this time, we have to have a united campaign. I hadn't understood that in 79 we had Labour on both sides, we had the SNP on both sides, we had the Tories on both sides. And he said, and we'll need the SNP on board. And Nigel was able to do that. And that led to the creation of Scotland Forward, which I worked with Nigel to set up, which became the kind of umbrella. So each of the parties had their own, but we were the Yes, Yes campaign. So between then and the referendum, that was my role. And of course, we then had the death of Diana, which we thought might lead to the referendum being cancelled. But we suspended for a week. And when campaigning was resumed, I was actually in London doing a programme on the BBC, which, if I'm honest, I couldn't imagine happening now. BBC 2 and Radio 4 hosted a whole programme, a whole hour, and it was me for Yes, Yes, and it was the vice chair of the Think Twice campaign, and it was a phone-in. So we had people phoning in from all over the UK, and I loved it because I had an aunt sitting in Warrington and my mum sitting in Kirkcaldy watching this programme. And then we had the referendum and we won, obviously.
Yes.
The whole programme of the convention, the SNP declined to stay in because they wanted a multi-option.
Yeah.
The convention were very clear, we need unity behind a single proposal. SNP came on board, obviously. The Conservatives knew it was coming, so they joined as well. So we had the 4 main parties and folk like Campbell Christie and Kenyon and myself and Joyce McMillan and others round the table. And we continued the kind of consensus building to develop what became the Standing Orders and Procedures and the 4 principles which the Parliament adopted. 20 years on, we persuaded Ken Mackintosh to reconvene the CSG and do a review.
Yeah.
And we had Henry McLeish and George Reid and Jim Wallace as 3 people who'd served at a very senior level in the Parliament round the table. And there was real unanimity across almost everything. There was 1 or 2 areas of difference about what had been achieved, which was significant, but about what hadn't. And the first one was that whole new politics and consensus building had gone out the window. And we now had a Parliament that in some ways is almost worse than Westminster. One MSP who stood down said to me, "This is more fiercely whipped than a Westminster Parliament."
Really? That's interesting.
Now, but if you read the full CSG report, you'll find 2 words that never feature: whips and opposition. We didn't want whips, we wanted business managers. It was going to be consensual, so you wouldn't need whips. And we didn't want an opposition. But of course, Alex Salmond was very clever and very quickly established the SNP as the official opposition, which got them all sorts of status and funding and all of that. And in a way, that set the tone, because suddenly we had a government, albeit a coalition, and an opposition.
Yeah.
So that was the biggie. The whole culture wasn't there. The second was the committees, for a whole variety of reasons, which we might explore, had not worked the way we'd hoped. And the third was the commitment to devolve power out of Edinburgh had not only not been delivered, the reverse had happened. And I think I said that day, on all of those presentations I did, I don't think there was ever one where I wasn't asked, won't this Parliament just suck power up from local government? And I said, hand on heart, no, absolutely not. There's an absolute commitment to the European Charter of Local Self-Governance, to power of general competence, and the principle of subsidiarity, which means powers will be devolved to the most appropriate local level.
Sorry to interrupt, just going back to those meetings. So you obviously had, so the one on education, what could happen to Scottish education on all levels with a Parliament. So was there already at that stage an agreement that all of the education and other aspects would be devolved? At what point were those decisions made? I've always assumed that was a decision that got made in London, but maybe that's not true.
Well, and it's a really important point, Marlene, because if we compare the 79 scheme for an assembly, one of the reasons they were able to derail that, not the only one, was because there was a whole argument about what would be devolved. The 92 scheme still took that approach. What the benefit of that last few years gave us was the opportunity to realise, partly from sheer pragmatism of being able to get the legislation through, but also from a point of principle, the assumption was, instead of defining what will be devolved, we'll define what is reserved and everything else will be devolved by default. Because we said the internet hadn't been invented in 92. Suddenly we're doing this scheme in 95 and it has. Will that be devolved? Will that be reserved? Are we going to have to go back to Westminster every time something new steps up? So what we said was, and it turned out to be much more complex, but still, foreign affairs, defence, macroeconomic policy, and I think taxation, other than the power to vary, which we got, would all be reserved and everything else would be devolved.
Including broadcasting. Was that originally supposed to be?
No, I think that was one of the ones we lost. Broadcasting, there was a fight about, and I think if you were to go back, or if I were to go back to the Scotland Bill and Scotland Act, we would find other things snuck their way in. But when I was doing those presentations, that was what I was saying. So it means we will have complete power over education, health, housing, transport. Of course, we didn't get all of transport in the end, and local councils, of course. We didn't get the power of general competence, the European Charter. The UK eventually signed up, but they've never adopted it into law. And there are all sorts of other things, smaller things. That
so those discussions, were they with you, between you and a group in London at Westminster?
Oh, no. Let's give the Labour Party their due. And of course, when I was the coordinator, I was still a member of the Labour Party. I think I'd probably killed any chance I ever had of being a Labour candidate. Because when I was interviewed, I was asked. The panel had Tommy Shepherd as the Deputy General Secretary of Labour at that point, Andy Miles of Lib Dems and Kenyon. And I think it was Andy asked me, you're a Labour Party member, how? And I said, my commitment to democracy in the Parliament comes first. So when I arrived, a lot of that work had been done. What you had was the convention itself, which was all the MPs, Scottish MPs, other than Tam Dalyell and the Conservatives. I think every council was involved at that point. You had the trade unions, the women's groups, business groups. The SCDI joined as an observer, so they could be neutral. So you had all of those people around a table, which was like 160. Wow. And that was chaired by, at that point, Harry Ewing and David Steele. Under that, you had an executive committee, which Kenyon chaired, and that had about 20 people. So that had George Robertson and Jack McConnell. It had Jim Wallace and Andy Miles. It had Campbell and Bill Spears. Dougie Chalmers of the Democratic Left, somebody from the Green Party. So that was the executive, and that met fairly regularly. And then beneath that, you had the coordinating committee, which was very small. And that was Jack and Andy and Campbell and Kenyon. And that was really where I reported to, if you like.
Yeah.
The discussions went on behind the scenes, which is what they do. But the concessions the Labour Party made were huge. The fact that George Robertson and Jack McConnell were able to get Labour in London, because we're not kidding ourselves. Gordon and Tony and others were on this. And Donald Dewar as well, they managed to get a commitment to say we'll sign up to PR. And in a way, signed away any chance they had of being completely in control. Yeah. But they also fought really hard. And, I have my issues with Donald sometimes, but I know Donald, especially in the drafting of the bill and getting it through to an act, fought tooth and nail at Cabinet to make sure that the conditions that they had agreed to were honoured as far as could possibly be done. And I know what would be happening we'd be sitting at an exec, not at a whole convention. They were really ritualistic and rubber stamping. But at the executive, there'd be some really heated discussions. And then it would probably be down, in the first instance, to Jack and Andy as the two general secretaries to go away and argue about things and work with Jim and George. But again, I never underestimate the power of Campbell Christie and Kenyon. Kenyon to be the absolute terrier that challenged them in public and held their feet to the fire. And Campbell, who was just the absolute arch politician and negotiator. And he knew what was possible. And I don't think we'll ever know quite how much we owe to him for holding the feet to the fire quietly behind the scenes. And Jack went on as First Minister to do the same for STV, for local government, because he absolutely believed. But he faced enormous opposition from the traditional Labour Party members who did not want to give up first past the post, and many of them still don't. So they did a lot, and that's how the discussions happened. And then they would come to the coordinating group to finalise, they would go to the exec, and then the big decisions would go to the whole convention. But I think I've only met 3 or 4 times in my time there.
It's fascinating. It's really fascinating to hear all that. I mean, at the time, well, I wasn't politically kind of engaged. I mean, I just knew who I voted for, and I carried on voting for them. Until I stopped voting for them. I would know that this was in the background somewhere, but from my point of view, actually, I just didn't ever come across and didn't look for that, more information. It's just fascinating hearing about.
When I think back to what we must have been doing, given that we had no internet, we had no social media, we didn't have any of those kind of things. And I remember in the run-up to the referendum, and I can't remember where I was, no matter, there was a bunch of lawyers there, and they were giving me a really hard time about how are we supposed to know how to vote? What do you mean? Well, we don't know. And I said, wait a minute, do you read newspapers? The Daily Record, the Scotsman and the Herald have been running features for days, running the detail of what it would mean in policy areas, and people hadn't read it. And they were still, at the 11th hour saying, well, how do we know how to vote? We don't know what this is about. But that was our only mechanism. Endless television discussion programmes and newspapers.
Yeah.
That was it.
Isn't that interesting? Because if you think about nowadays, if we were trying to have a rerun of that or any other referendum, there is no way you'd have a joined up view from the mainstream media that was anything other than here's what Westminster think. And nobody watches TV very much these days either.
And you have to remember, of course, and it was probably absolutely predictable, the Scotsmen had been pro-devolution for 100 years. Yeah. So they were absolutely on our side. And then along came Andrew Neil, and Andrew Neil wanted to rip it all up because he was so hostile. Yeah. And the other thing we had, which was a major challenge, were some major employers. Standard Life and Scottish and Newcastle are the two I remember, but I think the Bank of Scotland might have been too. Their chief execs and boards were hostile, and the Scottish and Newcastle hostility, I have to say, I choked on when they ended up being able to sell Donald Dewar the site for the Parliament. There's an irony in there somewhere, I think.
If you think then about your aspirations for the Parliament back then, there was a couple of things that you have worked out better than you thought they would, and perhaps a couple where you're disappointed.
In the previous 10 years, there had only been 3 bills about Scotland's health service at Westminster. The positive is that where we've needed legislation, we've been able to do it. The downside of that is we're now legislation mad, and we legislate for everything, and that's not clever. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. But the thing that came to me in the very first event in the 25th anniversary series was when Ken McIntosh said, you need to remember, we abolished poindings and warrant sales. And looking at the audience in that room, most of them didn't know what we were talking about because they don't remember. It was Tommy Sheridan that put that forward, and they got unanimous support. We would never have got time at Westminster, never to have done that. So there's an absolute classic. STV for local government, huge. Smoking ban, huge. Minimum pricing for alcohol, huge. Several examples that are things we did that set a tone and were really progressive, and we would never have got to do before. What haven't we done? Well, if I go back to that CSG report...
Let's just say what CSG stands for again.
Sorry, the Consultative Steering Group who drafted the report that formed the standing orders for the Parliament. Okay, so good. Donald Dewar set that up, and there were 12 of us chaired by Henry McLeish. And when we were reconvened in the 20th anniversary by Ken McIntosh again, he hosted a lunch, and then he made himself scarce, and Henry chaired it like it was a CSG meeting, and it was like it had been yesterday since we met. We agreed wholly about the culture. We agreed wholly about the fact that it hadn't been bold enough. And we agreed wholly about the local government issue and the decentralisation of power. There were other disappointments, but those were the biggies. They're not bold enough. I don't know where to start. Public service reform is my current thing, of which Build a Local Scotland is part, and we may come on to that. Subsequent governments have talked about reforming the NHS. None of them have done it yet. They've tinkered around the edges. The other commitment that was in the convention scheme was that not only would we devolve power down to local councils, and they'd be properly local councils, we'd review the Quango state. We haven't done that. So that's another issue. The big one, which I've really only become aware of, is land reform. Yeah. We've made progress. It's pathetic.
It's pathetic,
When I see what's happening in Mull about their school, when I see what's happening around energy, because that reminded me, I think that's another reserved area. I mean, I despair. We've got such poverty and inequality, and if we were allowing communities to take control of their own energy generation, we'd be transforming parts of Scotland that are in desperate need. I was on the SCDI policy committee in the 80s, and we were arguing about the grid then. And here we are, nearly 50 years later. So land reform's a huge one. Local government's another. I think the whole public health that should be in local government. Housing, where's the bold action to solve the housing crisis? And if I'm honest, all of that comes back to the culture of the chamber.
That idea of everybody working together but from a different perspective for the benefit of Scotland, totally wonderful idea. But then you just have to watch. I mean, I watched FMQs this morning, and you've got Labour and Tory, or both Tories, blue and red Tories, have clearly coordinated their attack lines behind the scenes. They were just vicious
Yeah.
Nothing constructive in there, just kicking lumps out of the SNP. And it's purely, who's going to be top dog in Holyrood 2026. I don't understand how any political party benefits from that. But we've had a couple of recent episodes that we've done of this podcast with different people, and we've come to the conclusion that actually it would do the Scottish Government a lot of good if they get a bit bullshit and take on Westminster instead of fighting with each other. What about taking on some of those topics you just named there? Absolutely on the list of things we'd like. And just because it's reserved doesn't mean there's nothing you can do about it.
Absolutely.
And doesn't mean it should still be reserved. Pick a fight that everybody can get behind.
FMQs, I never watch it. If you were to read the CSG report, you would see there was never an intention to have FMQs.
Wow.
And I remember arguing with the senior civil servant, and he said, but you have to have First Minister's questions, Esther. You have to have a bit of theatre. And I'm going, have you watched Prime Minister's questions? A lot of hate and no light. If you get those politicians, and I've done this in different settings, behind the scenes to talk about the health service. It's the one I know most because I've chaired 3 health boards, and it drives me nuts. I am absolutely pro-free at the point of use National Health Service, don't get me wrong, but it needs radical reform. And I don't think I've spoken to a single politician of any party that doesn't agree with that. But as soon as you put them in front of a camera or in the chamber, they revert to party politics. Now, to be fair to them, that's a culture that has evolved more broadly, not just in our Parliament. And one of the issues, of course, is the media, which doesn't help.
Yes, yeah.
And it comes back to the committees. And again, it didn't work the way we'd planned. You have a single status committee. You don't have select and standing. They build up expertise. They can develop plans for legislation, but they also scrutinise the policy and legislation of government, and they will do post-legislative scrutiny. And the one I think of is the football...
sectarianism, yeah.
They did the bill, they made the act, it didn't work. They did a review, and I think they undid the legislation.
They did, yeah.
And our view was that that would be the way to do grown-up legislation, and it would get us away from this screaming U-turn that makes headlines.
I watch the committees a lot. I like the committees partly because they're talking about a topic rather than kicking lumps out of each other. And the one I've been following most recently is the Land Reform Bill. It's going through its scrutiny stage. And actually some of the discussions there are really very good. And sometimes if you didn't know which party the person was on, you wouldn't necessarily know from the discussion. And when they get to the voting, there's sometimes surprising groups of people on, voting for or against something. But so I do think the committees are a much better example of how it can work.
They are. But I've given him evidence in front of all sorts of committees. And most recently it's got the longest title, Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee, about a report that I did for government. And I would absolutely agree with you. If I hadn't known which party those people were from, I wouldn't have been able to tell. It was a really well done, rigorous session. They'd done their homework. They asked all the right questions. But there are 2 things that went wrong with it. The first one was, it was stage 2 of the bill, and in the end they voted along party lines. It's chaired by COCAB, the SNP. Maggie Chapman of the Greens was vice chair, and the Greens and the SNP voted to approve the principles. What's worse is, a year down the line, they get to stage 3 of the bill, and this is what went wrong with our aspirations. We had planned this on the basis that the membership of the committee would be the same for the 4 years, now 5, so they would be able to build up expertise. When that committee came to stage 3, it had a new convener, because Cowcab was away being a minister, and half the members had changed, and it had a new senior clerk. So the vast majority of the people around that table had not sat through the hours of rigorous evidence. That was never the intention. And I think I may have said this at the spring conference. One of the reasons that happens is because we have too many ministers and too many reshuffles. And this is not just an SNP issue, it's been an issue all the way through. The First Minister decides to reshuffle, appoints these new ministers, and then completely reshuffles the committee. And somebody said to me, I am halfway through a term and I am the only person left on my committee that was on it at the beginning. That doesn't build up expertise. Now, that's where the CSG review disagreed, because the three MSPs and ministers, as they'd been, had of course all been at Westminster. And I think they were probably the ones that most thought we should go back to having standing and select committees like Westminster. And the answer is no, have fewer ministers. A parliament of 129, and we've got 29, I think the latest count is, in the cabinet.
Mind you, they've got a lot broader remit now than they had when they started, though, haven't they? Because more has been devolved. So that
and actually that's an argument for having, as in Wales, more MSPs for a start.
Exactly. Yeah.
But actually, the most effective cabinet, it hurts me to say it sometimes, but I think was when Alex Salmond was first elected in a minority with a small, tight-knit cabinet. Yeah. And I remember chairing something that John Swinney was speaking at, and I was astonished. John knew exactly what was happening across all the different briefs. And I found that with subsequent cabinet secretaries, because it was a small, tight-knit group. The difficulty I've got with the notion that they've got more responsibilities, we don't have bold policy and we don't have joined-up policy. And what we're doing with a ministerial team that big is we're fragmenting it further and further. So when we talk about health, we're not talking about health, we're talking about the NHS. And yet we talk about improving health and prevention. Well, actually, that's not the NHS's job. You build walls around all these policy areas rather than having a small, tight-knit strategic team. But you also have a parliament that, because of that centralisation, is trying to do everything. Westminster's the same. They think they can control what happens from the seat of the parliament, and they can't. And the real thing that would be better would be to start giving away all those powers. Empowering local councils and local communities and doing the bit that only they can do, focusing on that high-level strategic vision and doing a handful of really big things really well.
Because earlier you said that there's too much legislation. So that's the kind of symptom of that then. If instead of going for the legislation, they said, who could best fulfil the reform of this? And if the answer is local government,
then do it.
And of course, some local governments are huge and some are very small. But anyway, there's not very many of them. So that could lead into all sorts of new avenues, couldn't it?
Absolutely. And if I come back to the CSG and the 4 principles that we drafted, that the Parliament adopted, the third principle, I think it is, the second half of it says, and the Parliament will take a participative approach to the development, consideration and scrutiny of policy and legislation. The original draft of that only said legislation. And I think it was Henry and the civil servants who came back and said, actually, it is a legislature, but we don't have to legislate for everything. Policy matters, and policy's in there. The one I quote regularly, and there are loads, we have performative legislation. We have a bill, an act, that guarantees you will only wait 12 weeks for treatment.
I know, I heard that. I thought that was ridiculous.
I've got friends that have gone private to get their hip done because they've waited 3 years. They absolutely understand why they're having to wait. What does that legislation do or mean? Absolutely nothing.
One thing that it does is give Scottish Government's opponents an open goal.
Absolutely.
Ammunition.
It's ammunition. It's just silly, isn't it? I mean, obviously, there would still be some bills going through, and there's a need for that, obviously. But it would, in addition to that, be coming up with something that's a bit more principial on a particular topic, and then passing that to say local authorities.
Councils to do.
That would be brilliant, wouldn't it?
Well, and in some ways, it's not even that. I mean, we need a parliament to look at a Scottish transport policy. We need a parliament to do the land reform stuff. And we need a parliament that runs the taxation system. Local councils can't do all of that. They could do some. Where all of this comes from for me, which is, I don't know where it came from originally, but it's why I got involved in this whole movement. Top down doesn't work. Even the army recognises that. They don't expect an officer out on the field in battle to be referring back to headquarters for permission to do something. There's a whole raft of health reforms coming, some of which are very well intentioned. The culture from the Parliament and the government is still top down. All the evidence says the answers to these things lie in communities. And we wonder why we've got the kind of failure of democracy and the complete lack of trust and faith And it's because democracy is so far removed from communities.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting here in Dalgety Bay with 12,000 people, and we don't have a council. If we had proper councils at a very local level that could do the local stuff, and then strategic councils to do the more strategic, and then government doing the stuff that only government can do. And I'm going to be at an event next week, and it's all about what can we learn from combined authorities and elected mayors in England. And the answer is, don't do it from the top down. You know, they're trying to say to Glasgow, you need a combined authority and a mayor. Well, if the people of Glasgow don't want it, why should they?
Yeah.
Actually, if they had the proper powers, they could do what all the Scandinavian countries do, and they could join up voluntarily with other councils to do the things that they're not big enough to do for themselves. We think because Andy Burnham's doing a great job, the mayors of the thing. Tell me the name of another mayor in England. I can't. It's still a very centralised approach, and it's not about giving communities the powers to do what they want. If you imagine Mull had a council, do you think they would have had the decision they've made about that secondary school? That means half their kids are going to have to go to Oban to go to school. But it's Argyll and Bute Council, which is how far away? How many of them come from Mull, you know?
One of the things that kind of reinforces that going in the wrong direction is the culture at Holyrood, isn't it? Because at FMQs, the number of times you have opposition parties coming up with, here's a constituent of mine and something's gone wrong, they've waited in an ambulance. Well, that's terrible, but why is that FMQs? Why is that the place that you would resolve an individual person's experience? And yet, as long as they keep taking it on, going, oh, I'll look into that, that's dreadful.
Exactly that. If you ask any of them that have been health secretaries, why do you get involved in those discussions? They say, because if we don't, we feed the opposition lines to attack us with. But the answer is, you've got an NHS Scotland and you've got 22 health boards. It's their job. Given the convention scheme, given the aspirations, given the commitments, when I heard the Parliament debating whether or not to have a tourist tax, and if we have a tourist tax, should it be a flat rate? Should it be a percentage? Should it be uniform across the country? The answer is, it's none of your business. Let local government decide, like any council in Europe does. And you know, they were arguing about, should it be £5 a night, should it be £2? And I'm thinking, oh my goodness me.
Do you know, I felt the same thing about the Theft of Dogs Act. I thought, why is the Parliament
because councils don't have the powers to do those things. To be fair, and let's not make it look like it's all the Parliament's the bad boys and the councils are the good guys. The Parliament and government tends now to treat local government as the delivery arm of central government, which it's not. You could argue local government does the very same to the third sector. Rather than seeing them as genuine partners, they are seen as a delivery arm and they're seen as almost dispensable. If we need to cut, we'll cut the third sector, despite the fact the third sector quite often delivers better services at a much lower cost and that are much closer to what communities and families want and need.
And there's a whole discussion we could have about that. I mean, having been a chair of our local development trust, you know, we are the backstop in that you can get people who'll work for nothing. And actually, is that how we want to deliver our services?
No. And the development trust movement's a fantastic thing, and I believe would still have its place. In Build a Local Scotland, we're having that conversation. Is it that we want local councils that would remove the need for development trusts? And the answer is no, not at all. But development trusts are often having to do what they do in the face of difficulties caused by local and national government. They're doing it for nothing, they're exhausted, and they don't have the powers or the budgets. Give all of these people their place and their respect, and it comes back to needing a written constitution that delineates what the powers are. And that European Charter of Local Self-Government, to be fair, the Parliament did pass that bill and Westminster put a stop to it. But if we were being assessed against that charter, as other countries like Estonia are, we would fail miserably. We do not comply with most of it. And it's back to taxation. The Parliament's powers of taxation are limited. The local government could have lots of powers for taxation within the devolved settlement that would raise significant amounts of money for the country.
And they could do other things as well. I mean, they can do things on energy, on heat, on especially heat, and in a way that actually, you know, Holyrood can't. Going back to, you know, there's been a shift from how you were thinking about it, you know, before it got set up, and then in the first few years when they didn't even refer to themselves as a government, did they? It was the Scottish Executive.
Henry MacLeod tried to do it and got slapped down by Westminster, but he did it anyway.
And then Alex there, first of all, with the minority government, interesting what you said about, you know, that you thought that actually was a period that was a good period. And then Alex's character was his character. I mean, he was a showman. Now, I'm not, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way.
No.
I mean, it was, you know, I mean, he could get people going. He was also a visionary. You know, he'd stand there and say, young people in Scotland will pay fees for university, you know, before I'll let that happen, before the rocks melt in the sun. I mean, we all got that kind of goes in. So I'm not by any means kind of being derogatory with that, but he was who he was. And then since 2014, my theory is maybe there was increasing personalities involved in it, maybe not. But after 2014, I kind of have always felt that the antagonism, the way that FMQ people talk to each other in FMQs has got worse post the referendum. Now, I think sometimes it wasn't quite like that when you had, at the same time, you had Nicola, Keziah and Ruth. You know,
absolutely.
Three very different sets of political opinions. Yeah. But they could kind of, probably going a bit far to say they worked together, but there wasn't that antagonism quite.
There wasn't the aggression.
There wasn't the aggression.
Agreed.
So do you
I saw a headline the other day about Kate Forbes and about Nicola and how unpleasant it's made it for women. And I do think there is no doubt that the three women leaders had a different style. I mean, Ruth was robust, to put it mildly, but I thought that worked really well. But I do think there's very definitely a gender issue in there whilst Nicola was leader. But I do think also the referendum became divisive. And I've been at a number of events, and, you know, I talk about my sons and how engaged they were and their friends were. And what I saw 95% of was a very engaged, lively, positive debate. But I have heard people, and Joanne was one of them, talk about their experiences of being abused crossing Glasgow's George Square and the like, and that their experience was poisonous and unpleasant. And I think that has carried on. And I'm really sad about that, because whatever you believed and however you voted, 85% turnout was an astonishing thing. I mean, we always make the point. We had, I think, I've now forgotten the figures, it's 60-something or 70-something percent turnout in the referendum in 97. We've never achieved that level of turnout in an election to the Scottish Parliament since. It's almost like we got it and then everybody just sat back. And part of that may be now about that disillusionment, but part of it was just about, back to your point, there was a really passionate, positive message about getting our Parliament that galvanised people and got them engaged. And one of the things we've not talked about, but for me, and there are really obvious explanations for it, but civic society, you know, the organisations, played a huge part in the convention, and then they seem to dissipate. The Church of Scotland's influence has disappeared to a certain extent. The STUC isn't quite up the middle of it. But actually, one of the reasons, and I remember Bill Spears saying to me, be careful what you wish for. I said, what do you mean? He said, we knew that getting a Parliament would generate all sorts of activity. He said, we can't keep up. They want us involved in everything. There's all these consultations, there's all these, you know, participative events. We don't have the resources to be engaged in them all, which then narrows your ability to be engaged in the kind of broader debates about, you know, the future. So I do think there's an issue there. And also, again, the kind of certainly UK-wide and probably global fragmentation, and, you know, there's no such thing as society and all of that stuff.
The whole polarisation of populism and fascism. Can we go on and talk a little bit about building a local Scotland? This was the leaflet that came out. This is where we met you for the first time. You were on stage and we were recording the event, which we thought was a great event. We were really engaged in it. Coming up for a year ago.
It was September the 9th.
I recall at the time you had a website set up. You had this, which was a little booklet as well. I'm not sure I've seen much since. So what's happened since, and where are we?
We had a spiel of activity between the launch and last Christmas, and then we hit a bump or two in the road, and there's been a bit of a hiatus. We've now regrouped and we're taking a different approach, and part of that is about things have moved on. And of course, we've got in parallel government running the local governance review and democracy matters. We've got the Parliament planning its citizens panels and all of that. Because of course, one of our calls was for a citizens assembly or citizens assemblies to define. Part of the issue is we didn't raise the money we thought we were going to raise, so we've not had the resource to put an organiser in place. We're still on that case. But we're now working more closely with COSLA. And we've got some plans with them. It's their 50th anniversary this year, so again, a biggie. And we're looking at working to see whether or not we could get a group of organisations to come together. The document's really persuasive, but people aren't going to read all of that. What we've realised is there's not enough to just say we need more local councils because that's what other countries do. We need to be able to say to people, this is what would be better. Here's how it might look and here's what they might do. So we've regrouped around that theme. We're very well aware that a lot of people signed up and we haven't been in touch, and we need to fix that. Twitter, of course, was one place we were very active. I'm not on Twitter anymore, and I won't refuse to call it the other thing. And we had all sorts of big, bold ideas, but without an organiser. We're a bunch of 9 individuals. And the origins of it were, I don't know if you'll remember, there was a big event called the Breakup of Britain, which marked the death of Tom Nairn. And that was a phenomenal event, but you know, what came of it? Nothing very much. But I was there, and Leslie Riddick and Joyce McMillan were both on the platform, and I got chatting to them. And we got chatting about the 25th anniversary, which hadn't featured, and about the local government issue. And from there, Leslie had a number of conversations, as did I, and that was how we pulled the group together. And we're a completely random bunch. On both sides of the independence debate, we've got Ewan Aitken, who was a council leader. We've got Dave Watson from Jimmy Reid, who was a Unison organiser. It's a fascinating bunch. But we have no status, if you like. We're a bunch of well-intentioned individuals. So we have regrouped and we are looking to see what we can do next. We are up against the drive for combined authorities, bigger councils, elected mayors, which is exactly the opposite direction we believe needs to be going in. And I remember Campbell Christie saying in the convention, Ian Lang gerrymandered, frankly, local government in the 90s to try and achieve a particular political outcome. And I was running an organisation and my chair was a Tory councillor. And I remember her saying to me, I don't know why he's doing this. He just wants to break up Strathclyde. Break that up into 6, leave the rest where it is. It made no sense whatsoever. If you go back 50 years to when COSLA was created, that was on the back of the Wheatley Commission. And Wheatley created the districts and the regions. But he talked then, Lord Wheatley and his commission talked then about local councils that would take on a whole raft of new powers, including public health and primary care and some of the health service functions, which is one of the areas I'm interested in. We've had the Commission for Local Democracy, Strengthening Local Democracy 10 years ago that COSLA established. It said many of the same things. So we are now trying to find a way to pull all of those things together and show some kind of evidence, but also show this is how it might look and this is how it might make a difference to your lives, you know.
One of the things that I observe happening, this push for mayors and things, it looks to me, being cynical perhaps, that's just Westminster trying to find a way around the Scottish Government and deal direct with the councils, which is not, I don't think, a good thing. But I'm in the wee county, because there's only 51,000 people, and compared to the rest of the local authorities, we are tiny. And I was listening to one of the committees a couple of weeks ago, and Ellen Forson, who's the leader of Clacks Council, was giving evidence. And she was saying, of course, Clacks is so small, our voice gets ignored compared to these bigger places. And there was another guy giving evidence there who was a European citizen. And he said, Clacks Council is 5 times as big as the average council in Europe. But they're doing something really interesting, Clacks. They've got this transformational planning to create a kind of citizens panel to allocate resources to avoid all the different silos in public spending. And I thought that's a really good development. You've also got the people's panels at Holyrood, which we could play the clip of Jackson in a minute. But also we've just been to the Independence Forum for Scotland last weekend. One of the big topics of that is local democracy, is decentralising power. I mean, it just feels to me as if it's a topic whose time has come.
Absolutely. And I just saw something on LinkedIn this morning that sums it up. we are bombarded with the awful global news and the awful UK news of all that's wrong. We never hear the good stuff. You might want to think about chatting to somebody I met recently called Katie Kelly. Katie was the Deputy Chief Exec of East Ayrshire. She took early retirement, and she now chairs a UK organisation called New Local, which in itself is worth looking at because they do some fabulous stuff. But when Katie was in East Ayrshire, they ran a programme called Vibrant Communities. And they went out into, so in Clack's terms, they'd be going out into Alloa and Menstrie and all these wee places. And they were giving the community the tools and the support to develop a vibrant community plan.
Yeah.
And then they would present that from a platform, and the councillors and the officials would be in the audience. There are various examples. Joe, I've just forgotten his second name, won't matter, who was North Ayrshire, I think, when he was leader. He's Labour. He was doing community wealth building in North Ayrshire. There are all sorts of things happening all over the country. We have a Community Empowerment Act, which I don't know what it actually does, because when communities say, 53 communities say, we just want a pause so we can have a conversation, and they get ignored, that's not community empowerment.
Yeah.
So a Community Empowerment Act is all very well and all very well meaning, but actually, back to that, we legislate too much. It becomes performative. We've got a problem, we've passed a bill, we have an act, done, tick.
Yeah.
Nobody then says, has it changed anything? Has it made a difference? We've got an act on the statute book.
Is it within the Scottish Parliament's powers to change the number of local councils?
Absolutely. Local government is a responsibility of the Parliament. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I recall during one of the leadership debates a couple of leaders ago, Kate Forbes answering a question, what would one thing you would do if you became leader? And she said, I'd split Highland Council.
Absolutely.
And you think, well, of course, but then, she's now Deputy First Minister. Start with Highland Council. Could we split it? And then...
if I were drawing the map, I'd be saying you need a Highland region, but it's absurd. I mean, I remember we ran a programme with the Electoral Reform Society before the 14 referendum, and it was called Democracy Max. And the premise was ERS would not take a position for or against independence, but their argument was whether we vote yes or no will make no difference if all the power sits in Edinburgh. And I remember reading the report. I chaired one of the they did 3 kind of sub-strands, but at the People's Assembly that kicked it off, there was a Fife guy there who said, why is it that I live in St Andrews and I have to go to Glenrothes to ask permission to put up a sign? Well, imagine what it's like if you live in Caithness or Ullapool and you have to go to Inverness. It's absurd. The Parliament absolutely has the power. We've got a very good local government committee. Ariane Burgess is absolutely committed. Have we seen any progress towards it? No. And part of the reason, to be fair, it makes it easy not to do it because there's not a single causal view on it.
Interesting.
The leader of Fife Council believes Fife Council is the ideal size. I disagree with him. I might argue for a Fife region, but I want a Dalgety Bay Council and a Kinghorn Council and a Kirkcaldy Council. Thank you very much. And part of it is there's a lot of vested interests, because if we move to the kind of model, as soon as you say to somebody, Norway's the same size as Scotland and they've got 12,000 councillors and we've got 1,200, folk go, I don't want more councillors.
Yeah.
But the answer is, when Fife had even just 4 councils, 3 districts in a region, our councillors were part-time and they weren't paid. Now we've got councillors who are full-time and it's their job. The responsibilities they've got, they need it to be.
I mean, one thing I just talking about Clacks Council there that I picked up recently is that only 19% of what the council needs to spend comes from council tax. Absolutely. To get that fully paid, it would have to go up to about 2-3 grand a month. It's just not going to happen.
But you imagine if they could design all sorts of taxes of their own, whether it's tourist taxes or land taxes or business taxes, there are all sorts of options. Somebody ran a session on the back of a report that had been produced by a woman called Heather, who had worked in Scotland, in Scottish Government, but she was back in New Zealand. And I didn't agree with all of it, but she'd done the whole analysis of the range of taxes we could be raising. And actually, I'm one of these people that thinks a tax on income is the wrong thing. We should be taxing wealth, we should be taxing pollution, we should be taxing land. And when you begin to see the things that would flow from that in terms of, you know, if you were taxing a land, it would begin to change the land ownership model. You know, you do away with all these grouse moors and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
You know, there are lots of opportunities. It was a fantastic report. I've never seen it considered by government.
You mentioned there used to be 4, or maybe it was 3 and 5 plus the 5 the region one. When it was like that, and there weren't full-time councillors, was it that there was more cooperation between councils? Because, you know, one of the things that I picked up from the Building Local event was, because I was sitting there going, well, that's all very well, but I mean, some councils are really rich. And other councils, you know, are just not going to be. And, you know, actually there was a very good answer came to that about, well, and that's going to have consequences. People have to talk to each other. It's in everyone's interests to be looking at what's happening on their neighbouring council, because that will have consequences. So that seems to me to be another big advantage that would come out of going smaller, that people would have to cooperate to each other.
Of course, Fife at one point, I discovered in Andy Whiteman's book, had 85 councils, which is an astonishing number when you consider at that point the population would have been a lot smaller than it is now. But at last count, and I'll be out of date, but at last count we had 350,000 people, and we've got Fife Council. Before 96 we had Fife region and 3 districts. I don't remember enough about how that worked, and I don't think 3 districts were enough either. That doesn't give you the kind of local democracy we're talking about. We did a fringe event at the SNP conference last year with Build a Local Scotland, and there was a woman there from Norway, and she said, in terms of accountability, I'm held accountable. I go and do my shopping on a Saturday and everybody knows who I am, and they can nobble me there and then about whatever their issue is, you know.
And that's the beauty of small, isn't it? When I was the chair of our development trust, I knew most of our councillors in Clacks because you had a lot of interaction with them. And I wouldn't have been able to have that relationship if I'd been in Stirling Council, for example, which is immense. And it was so valuable. And when we were taking over our community centre, the council came to us. You know, we actually had people that were helping us through the process, and that you could go to, and they, we'll get you that, we'll help you with this. And it was really, really a positive outcome. My goodness, does it smooth the passage for a whole load
and
of
I can think of when I was involved with Oxfam, Scottish Advisory Group, years ago, and it was my first experience of the Development Trust Associations, and they took us on a tour of various projects, and the ones we met in the west of Scotland, it was the opposite. They were desperately trying to do things in the face of opposition and resistance from the council. So it does vary enormously, and a lot of that is absolutely about those personal relationships, for sure. And actually, if we come back to the council thing, making councillor a full-time job absolutely narrows the pool of who can do it.
Yes.
There's a bit of a theme about what we've been talking about, isn't there, about just how to catch people's attention and you know, encourage them to come in, and you know, how do you work against distrust in politics?
And even then in the 90s we were saying young people are not disengaged from politics, they're disengaged from party politics. It's not the same thing.
Actually, really, it's just been fascinating, and I mean, there's a whole load of other things we would have touched on, and it's really good talking to you, Esther.
Now, you'll remember Esther has mentioned a few times in the discussion about the principles that were set up for the Parliament and this consultative steering group. Now, that is still relevant today, and this is just a couple of weeks ago. This is Jackson Carlaw in his role as the convener of the Citizens Participation Group, the Petitions Committee.
As a principle for how this Parliament operates is of course not new. It's there in the foundations, one of the principles set out by the Consultative Steering Group on the Scottish Parliament, and it's part of the way we work in the Chamber and in committees. And after almost a full session of the Citizens Participation and Public Petitions Committee looking at how to embed participation in the work of the Parliament, I hope the principle of public participation actually now sells itself. So this time I'm here to talk about the approach the committee has set out in our report and blueprint. And our proposals represent really a relatively modest investment, an incremental way in which to embed an approach that is at the cutting edge of deliberative practice and has an incredibly positive and powerful impact on participants, supports scrutiny and can help address some of the most important challenges we face as a Parliament. I mean, since our last report, which we debated here in the Chamber, there have been 2 further people's panels. They are groups of around 25, one on the Climate Change Scotland Act in 2009, and one on reducing drug harm and deaths in Scotland. And these groups of 25 are randomly selected people who broadly represent the demographic makeup of Scotland. They don't decide things. They make recommendations which the committee, which Parliament, which parliamentarians ultimately decide. But they're brought together to consider a particular question. They hear from experts and are supported by trained facilitators to consider the information in front of them and agree on recommendations. People's panels in the Scottish Parliament context are very much tied to the scrutiny work of Parliament's committees.
I don't think it's very well known that we have citizens' panels. So there you go. But it's interesting, the link between that and what Esther was saying earlier. And just that there was one phrase that she used that stuck in my mind when she was talking about how they ended up being successful in their goal to get the Parliament established. And she said it was because all the different parties involved in the debate finally realised that to win, they needed a united campaign with unity behind a single proposal. I thought that's interesting. If you think of the fragmented kind of landscape we're in just now, that's what it's going to take, is to get people around the table.
I just really appreciated that she was prepared to come on the podcast, and she didn't know us, just apart from a wee chat after an event, and she was up for it. So that's great when people do that.
It's really great. And we'll put the links to the Building Local Scotland podcast that we did before in the notes, and if there is any updates that we hear of from Esther or anybody else in that space, we'll bring you, because this is to do with our democracy. This is important stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's it for now.
Bye.
Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to make sure you're following us and subscribe to us, then you get notified every time we put something new out, so you don't miss anything. That would be great. Also, you can click the little bell if you're watching on YouTube.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website, and we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.